In this video, we are going to take a look at a brand new variation from Leica on the Q3. This is the Leica Q3 43. So this is a new take on the Leica Q, but instead of the familiar fixed 28mm f1.7 Summilux lens, we have a newly designed 43mm APO-Summicron f2 lens that offers a more standard field of view, and I have to say, this new lens is very impressive. So many of you probably remember the original Q was released back in 2015, and since then we have seen 3 versions of the Q, and we've seen several variants of each version, including a QP, Q2 monochrome. So this is the first variant that we've seen that has a new lens. It's the first new lens on a Q in 9 years. All right, so let's talk about this new lens. So this is a 43mm APO-Summicron lens. What does that mean? Well, APO is the designation for an aberration lens, and so essentially what this means is in a standard lens design, you have 3 fields of light when it comes to color. So you've got red, green, and blue. So green and blue tend to match up at the focus point, and red is usually a little off. The result is chromatic aberration. You've seen this with color fringing in high contrast areas. So in an apochromatic design, all 3 of these fields are lined up evenly, and there are 2 benefits from this. First of all, you're going to have very little, if any, chromatic aberration, and second of all, because those color fields are matching up, you're going to have a higher perceived sharpness and resolution. So this 43mm focal length is really interesting. It is very unconventional for Leica, the one exception being the 40mm f2 Summicron C, which was made in the 1970s, and this lens is actually nothing like that. This is a much more technically advanced 43mm lens. It features 11 elements in 8 groups. 4 of these lenses are aspherical with 7 aspherical surfaces, and the lens features 2 focusing groups. So high optical performance is really important on the Q cameras, and the whole idea of these cameras, the whole concept initially when they came out, is to use a very high resolving prime lens that is fixed on the camera, and you could get focal length variations by cropping in camera, and there's a way to do this live. And so it's really cool. You can actually change the crop modes, and it gives you a series of frame lines, much like you see on the M cameras. Now, this is one change we have from that 28mm lens because our focal length has changed. So now we have 6 crop modes. The widest crop mode is going to be 43mm. You can crop into 60mm, 75mm. You can go up to 90mm, 120mm, and even 150mm. So we do lose some resolution at those longer focal lengths. However, the resolution of the lens and the quality and the fidelity of the image is still there. So I would argue that this is actually still usable if your output is for screen, so social media, something like that, and I'd rather them be there than not be there. But I would say up to the 90mm simulation, this is very usable, especially if you pair this up with something like the super resolution that you find in Adobe Lightroom, where actually you can double the size of the raw image. It works pretty well. All right, so just how good is this lens? Let's look at some image examples. The first one I want to show you is sharpness. So just as you would expect, if I zoom into 100% on this sunset, you can see the focus point is on these trees. This is wide open at f2, and you can see that we have plenty of sharpness. Now, the challenge is, do we have edge-to-edge sharpness? And as I scroll over to the edge, you can see that sharpness is certainly maintained. We have a great deal of resolution. And this isn't quite infinity. I put the focus on the tree line, but you can see that it does, at a far distance, maintain everything that you would expect. Now, another thing that I want to mention about the new lens is if you've ever shot on one of the Q cameras, the 28mm lens has that switch on the front where you can go into a macro mode. Well, the 43mm does too, and it is amazing. So this is the minimum focus distance on this shot, and if I zoom into one of my points of focus, you can see like on this fern, the little fibers that come off the end of it. It really is amazing the level of detail that you can get on here. And the fade off into the out of focus areas is absolutely gorgeous as well. Now, this is not a 1-to-1 macro mode. It's more like it gets you into a close focusing distance mode, but it does give you close enough focus so you can do a lot with that 43mm lens, and I would actually argue that extends the versatility of the focal length. So here's another example. As I said, this isn't a 1-to-1 macro, but if you don't mind cropping, you can certainly zoom in to 100% and get an enormous amount of detail in here. This is a really well-designed lens, which brings me to another thing that I want to talk about, which is bokeh. So if I pull back out on here, you can see even though we're in macro mode here, it is absolutely gorgeous. There's no doubled up lines or anything, and I realize that bokeh is something something that it comes down to opinions. What you classify as good bokeh is probably something that I might not like, or vice versa. But I think on this lens, and what I wanted to do was get a representation at least of what it looked like, and you can come to your own conclusion on this. So for instance, I'm gonna pull up another image. I shot this specifically to illustrate the point that I'm trying to make here, but if you look over on the left-hand side of the image, this is where our point of focus is on this board right here. But if I go back out, you can see this very smooth roll-off in transition into the areas that are out of focus. And this is a longer distance. This looks really good. The contrast holds up. It is absolutely incredible. Another example that I can give you that's going to be a real test here is anytime you have foliage in the background of an image, this is going to be a test of bokeh because it is so busy that it's going to bring out a lot of the character of the blur. So if it's not blurring or if it's doubling up, things like that, you're going to notice it right off the bat and it becomes distracting. This is something that is really quite beautiful, I think, and I don't think it becomes too busy. It's a lot of leaves back there and a lot of light coming through. And again, with this whole idea of the detail that you can get out of here, if I zoom in on my point of focus, you can see like little points of dew and droplets of water on this plant here, which is just beautiful. The other thing too is if you notice some of these points where the water droplets get really bright and you see that high contrast, a non-apochromatic lens might render some chromatic aberration in there if it's not well corrected, and then you don't see any here. So I think that's another testament to what we're looking at here. And you can see in this example here that the image quality is very consistent. This is in macro mode again at the minimum focusing distance, and the flower is the point of focus. We can see the background rendered here. It just fades off into little points of color. It's really quite nice. I mean, the one thing I love about this lens is there's a real 3D type feel to it. Not all lenses have that in terms of separation, and the reason I want to mention that is that I think a lot of people are going to look at this with the original Q lens being a Summilux designation, which usually means 1.4, even though that's a 1.7. And you think of f2.0, well, we don't have quite the out of focus areas or that separation, and that's not exactly true. And one thing that, I'll do a whole separate video on this, but one thing with Leica's apochromatic lenses, whether it's the M lenses, the SL lenses, or now this Q lens, is they have such a high point of resolution that you create this contrast with the fall off, and it allows you to isolate subjects, and it gives you that 3D look that makes the depth of field seem more shallow than it might be with an f2.0 designation. So let's talk about Leica's decision to go with a 43mm focal length, which is very uncommon with their typical prime lens lineup. So there are a couple reasons why they went with this. So the first of all is I think they are listening to their customers, and there were a lot of photographers who were interested in the Q, but felt like at the maximum resolution that they didn't want a 28mm lens. It was simply too wide, and a lot of those photographers fall into one of two camps, the 35mm camp or the 50mm camp, and I think that's why Leica split the difference and went with a 43, but there's another reason as well. So 43mm also corresponds to the diagonal of the full frame sensor size, and so the idea here is that 43mm will give you the closest proportions as seen by the human eye. So this is a really good focal length for things like street photography or even portraits. I've showed you a bunch of macro examples, and by the way, that macro focusing mode we talked about allows for focusing from 26.5 centimeters at the minimum to about 60 centimeters before you need to flip back into the regular mode. The lens also features a leaf shutter for flash sync at speeds all the way up to 1/2000th of a second, which is very impressive. And it also features optical image stabilization. So this has obviously been more of a lens video than a camera review, but that is the whole point, because the camera, other than the gray leatherette on the front, and obviously the updated crop modes, this is the same camera as the Q3. And I did a video on the Q3 when it came out last year, and if you're interested in any of the Qs, they're wonderful cameras, and I will link up to a playlist. I will give you a few specs, however. So just like the Q3, this is obviously a full-frame fixed lens camera. We have the same phase detect hybrid autofocus as before. The sensor is a tri-resolution backside illuminated sensor offering outputs of 18, 36, or 60 megapixels in both 14-bit RAW and 8-bit JPEG files. The sensor is capable of video recording up to Cinema 8K 420 10-bit at 29.97 frames per second, both internally or via HDMI output, and you can record up to 60p in 4K at 422 10-bit. Video recording can be done in a variety of codecs, including HEVC and ProRes 422 HQ. So my initial impressions of the Q3 43, I am very impressed. I think this focal length makes a lot of sense. I think it's very interesting in that it doesn't really compete with the M cameras at all. M cameras can't do close focusing, and definitely not a macro mode very easily anyway. And it doesn't really compete with the SL because you've got the smaller form factor. It's very compact, and I think this camera makes a lot of sense. It's interesting because I do see that Leica are listening to their customers, and I remember when the Q3 came out, this was a complaint that I saw quite a bit online, is that people said, well, it's just too wide. And so to offer a second option in terms of focal length just makes a lot of sense. And the lens is incredible. It's worth the price of admission alone. This lens is outstanding. This is the kind of camera that makes a lot of sense for somebody who wants something that's going to be more of a street photography camera that's not cumbersome to carry around. It's a little bit smaller and more compact than, let's say, the M system. And you also have weather resistance. So if you shoot in extreme weather conditions, this is a camera that could make a lot of sense as well. I would obviously love to know what you think, so drop me a comment or any questions that you have in the comments below. I'll do some more videos on this later on down the line. I think it's an awesome camera and a great addition to their lineup. I will see you guys in the next video. Until then, later.